Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back to the channel, and today I want to talk about one of my favorite subgroups of Marvel characters, supervillains. And I want to relate this and compare this back to a video that I made in March, so a few months back, about 6 months back, 5 months back, where I looked at the state of the game as far as villains were concerned, and I basically came to the conclusion, as you often do with Marvel Future Fight, that they're obsessed with heroes and they don't care about villains at all. And so I wanted to reassess that because we've had some pretty unique updates in the past 6 updates since I made that video. Not saying that the video is the responsible trigger or the catalyst for making that new content. Obviously they had that content planned in advance, but it's just interesting to see the trajectory of villains since then until now. But it's also interesting to note that the stats end up kind of being the same, which is kind of funny. So yeah, we have all the villains here in the game, and I would probably ask this question as a starting off point for you. Do you feel like, especially with the last Phoenix 5 update where we had 5 characters that all became supervillains who were previously heroes, except for, in some cases, Cyclops if you have certain uniforms for him, do you think that villains are now properly and adequately represented in Marvel Future Fight or not? And the results might surprise you. So in order to fully illustrate the results here, I first want to flash back to last time I did this sort of video. This was March 3rd, 2019. This was right after the Captain Marvel update where Ronan got a new uniform, but we had an update with 2 brand new villains. We had both Korath and we had Minerva. And so I went ahead and I plotted on the tier list all of the villains in the game minus all of the heroes. And at the time, I concluded that there were 63 or 63 or 62, somewhere in the 60s number of villains in Marvel Future Fight at the time, and it made up, about 31% of the villains in the game. But you can see they're pretty sparsely, they're pretty sparsely populated there from Mythic to Heroic, and then there's a lot more in the Rare, Advanced, and Normal tiers. Now let's take a look at where we're at right now. So if we throw this one up instead, this is what the tier list looks like now as of today, when we only talk about villains. So you have the bolded villains there, Namor, Cyclops, Emma Frost, Colossus, and Magic, who all find themselves sort of changing from villain to hero. But if you take a look at the numbers down here at the bottom, it's pretty much the same. Now, I did a few weird things in the old list where I added characters like Beast with his uniform, Destroyer, I added Venom, even though everyone uses the anti-Venom uniform. So even if you take into consideration those like hero villains and Destroyer, we are still only now, in 2019, at the end of the year pretty much, we're only at 68 villains. But it's interesting to note how things have changed. So I want to describe to you how things have changed because it's kind of cool, actually. So right after that update, that Captain Marvel update, right after I made that video, the very next update introduced 2 new combat villains, both Juggernaut and Sabretooth. And actually, as you'll notice, combat types make up the majority of villains in the game, period. It's actually quite an interesting thing. I think partially it has to do with us getting a lot of villains that were combat types before Marvel Future Fight was, super popular, sort of in the beginning stages of the game. Characters like Ulick, characters like Bullseye, Dr. Octopus, but also the Sinister Six. We had a lot of combat types, Sandman, Rhino, Lizard, so that also contributed to it. But you can see here, if you compare the old list to the new list, Juggernaut, Sabretooth, Molten Man, and Colossus are all brand new additions to combat that were never there before, and of course Namor as well. And so in addition to getting that update, that Sabretooth Juggernaut update, a few updates later, we got a fully villain update. We have, of course, the uniform for Mysterio, which is fine, but we got Hydro Man, Molten Man, and Electro. And so then you look at Electro, and then now you have another idea here, and if you look back at the other list, it's the same thing. There are like no speed types, man. There's 7 speed types. 7 speed type villains in the game, period. That's an incredibly small number out of 50 something odd. How many speed types do we have in the game here, guys? We have 49 speed types, and we had 7 of them being villains. So what is that, like 18% of them are villains, or not even 18%, less, like 15% of them are villains. So that's wild. If we look at the list now, it's pretty much the same. We have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We added 1. speed character that was a villain, which is Electro. So it's interesting to see that there's sort of a complete imbalance, whereas there's quite a few Blast villains. And we actually got a lot. We got 3 new Blast villains with the last update, so actually Blast would be underrepresented if they weren't there. We have a fairly high number of Universal villains, partially because we have the Black Order and Thanos, so that kind of disproportionately does things. But they add villains. They appear to add villains. Marvel Future Fight adds Universal villains quite frequently to the game, and then on top of that, you know, besides Blast and besides Universal, you have a shitload of combat villains and very, very few speed villains. So there's just an interesting sort of design choice on Netmarble's part to illustrate and to sort of have combats being the funnel or sort of the home for villains. Hey, we got a new villain. He punches and kicks. Should be a combat type. Hey, we've got a new character here, could be a villain or could be a hero, but they're kind of, you know, they like to dodge, they're kind of more agile. Let's make them a speed type, let's make them a hero. So it's kind of interesting. Perhaps they looked at something from a design point of view, you know, back when the game was first starting, and they had sort of core characters that they wanted to represent each of the types, and so they saw someone like Spider-Man as their sort of prototypical speed type. So he's a good guy, he's a hero, he's agile, he can dodge, he doesn't, you know, he's not necessarily the strongest character, he doesn't have the most stats, but he gets the job done. So that was their sort of prototypical speed type character, and that's why there's so few villains, because they keep looking at that prototype of Spider-Man, and of course, Spider-Man's not a bad guy. And then on the other hand, yeah, you have Captain America as a combat type, and then you have all these villains that are just kind of beefy boys who just punch and kick and use, you know, their bodies in some way. And especially when it comes to Spider-Man villains, they all just have bodily extensions that make them strong. Dr. Octopus has his tentacles, Lizard has his tail, you know, Rhino has the horn, Sandman has, well, he has his whole body, but, you know, Scorpion has the tail, Vulture has the wings. Vulture's the lone speed type, which is interesting. But yeah, so I wanted to point that out to you guys, and I'm just kind of shocked that we had 22 villains in the game when I made that video, March 2019, and now we've gotten up to 29 new villains, or sorry, not new villains, but these are villains that are in the Omega tier, Mythic tier, Legendary tier, and Heroic tier. So even though, sorry, I kind of goofed that one up, even though sometimes I get confused by my own stats, even though it seems as though there are a lot more good villains in Marvel Future Fight, and there are, it's only 7. And so it's really interesting that in spite of the fact that we've gotten so many villains lately, and we've gotten so many characters sort of switching sides over to being villains with the Phoenix 5 especially, we still have basically a very close percentage, almost the exact same percentage of characters being made up in the game of villains and heroes as they were back in March. So even if you take that 68, it's still 34%, which is only a few percentage points. It's 3 or 4% higher than it was back in March, despite the fact that we got, you know, an update with 5 new villains, and then before that we had the you know, Elementals update with 3 new villains. And part of that just has to do with the fact that every other update is basically just heroes, heroes, heroes. You had Namor, Silver Surfer, Wave. You've got the Bishop, Iceman, Jubilee. We've just got, you know, it seems as though these updates lately have been either heavily villain-themed or heavily hero-themed. And it's also interesting to note that the next update, although it's not going to be introducing that many new characters, we've got Brother Voodoo, Arrow, and Swordmaster. I was going to say Wave. They're all going to be heroes, presumably, so we're going to be getting 3 new heroes, and of the 8 new uniforms, at least, that we're getting, it seems as though they're all going to be, you know, heroes staying as heroes. And then there's also the possibility that they make Sabretooth a hero for some reason, but we'll have to wait and see how that goes. So we could actually even lose a villain with this next upcoming update. So I know this topic is not really one that's necessarily helpful. The only sort of helpful piece of advice that I have, the only sort of helpful thing I have to say as far as the villain sort of group goes is that, remember, there are leaderships in the game that apply only to villains. And this is something that I actually forgot recently until I played Danger Room yesterday, and someone said, well, you can use Thanos' leadership in Danger Room with Namor and Cyclops. And I said, well, but Thanos' leadership is only going to apply to... That's right. Thanos' leadership is going to apply to all 3 of them because his leadership... Where is Thanos? Because his leadership buffs up all villains. by 36 with the debuff. So that's a little tip that I have for you guys there. If you're struggling in Danger Room, try to make the first person on your team pick Thanos, because the debuff duration also helps against Strife. So it's actually really interesting, and it's something that didn't occur to me at first, you know, and it should occur to me with every new villain that gets added to the game, because they fall under that category of being applicable to Thanos' leadership, which does one thing: it makes Thanos' leadership better and better for PvP and PvE content. Whereas, you know, 90% of the time he's buffing himself, he can buff a lot more strong characters, especially when you look at the Mythic tier now having 3 new additions thanks to the Phoenix 5. So I think it's an interesting topic. I love talking about, you know, the sort of the balance of characters and the spread of characters in Marvel Future Fight, and why Netmarble makes certain decisions in terms of giving us a lot of characters of this type or of that type, or heroes or villains, male or female, blast, combat speed, you know, which ones are they choosing for tier 3, so on and so forth. It seems as though there's a lot of patterns. You know, speed types seem to be leaning heavily towards being support role, universals and combat seem to be heavily leaning towards villains and other things, and then blasts are kind of just all over the place, but generally just OP as hell. But with that being said, yeah, let me know what you guys think of the balance of villains and heroes in Marvel Future Fight. Is it good enough or not? I think the biggest thing we're missing right now, if I had to choose one off the top of my head, and it's the most important, is more villain-only support buff characters. So characters like Wave, characters like Coulson, but only for villains. We don't need that many because, again, there's not that many villains, but we need more now than ever, now that we have so many very strong villains that exist in the game that we can use in high-level content like Namor, like Cyclops, etc. So with that being said, hit me up in the comments. Let me know what you guys think. Subscribe if you enjoyed the content. Hit the like button if you enjoyed the video. And, of course, if you like what you see, I hope to see you very soon on the Facebook live stream roast on Twitch. Take care.